This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The so-called silent centuries between Malachi and Matthew aren't quite as silent as we've been taught. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. If you're watching us on YouTube, thank you. Please subscribe, share, click that bell for notifications, hit the like button. You know the drill. And then please stick around after the break. Tell you how to guarantee we never get canceled, because on this program, that is a risk. Joining us to discuss his new novels, which explores that period of time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. The new novels, Judah Maccabee Parts 1 and 2, Abomination of Desolation, and Against the Gods of Greece, which goes along with his nonfiction book that shows all the research, reveals all the research that went into the novels, the spiritual world of ancient Israel and Greece. We welcome back to the program award-winning screenwriter, best-selling novelist, Brian Godawa. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Derek. You are always the first guy I call when I'm ready to start doing interviews.
You know, I consider that high praise because I first heard about you on Issues, Etc. in St. Louis, as you were a regular guest there with Todd Wilkin, who he's a Lutheran pastor, but I got to say, he's one of the best talk show hosts out there, bar none, in any format. And so he was a regular listener to me on the way home, on the way home from work every day when I was back selling steel pipe in St. Louis. But heard you talking about social issues from your perspective as a Hollywood screenwriter. And since then, you've got several series of novels out there that explore spiritual warfare in a very real sense. And I think give people an opportunity to see in their mind's eye what these conflicts look like, what these small g gods, the fallen angels who've rebelled against their creator, are up to, and what they might be trying to accomplish, and how humans can respond. You know, it's the kind of thing that Sharon does with her Red Wing saga, although set in a more modern era, the Victorian age, as opposed to in the time of, say, Noah or Enoch or David or Jesus. But here, this most recent addition to your Chronicles of the Watchers series, you're taking on the story of the Maccabees. First of all, why that period of history?
Yeah, boy, that's complex. I mean, for any of your listeners who aren't familiar with me, I think most of them would be by now, or viewers or whatever. Yeah, it's rooted in the divine council worldview that Michael Heiser, who's influenced both of us deeply, it's rooted in that sort of revelation. In fact, I first started all of these books. I'm up to, 18, 19 books now, novels. And it all began with my first one, Noah Primeval. And I discovered Michael Heiser while I was doing the research for that book. And it just blew my mind. And then I thought, wow, I could have a few novels. At first I was just doing Noah Primeval because I actually was trying to get a screenplay written for it, right?
Okay.
And then when the movie came out, it's like, oh, well, that's not going to happen because I'm a nobody. So they're going to make that, Darren Aronofsky made his movie. Okay, that's fine. So I thought, well, I should put mine into novel format. And I just did that. But then I realized there was so much more to it. And I realized, oh my gosh, I could get a few stories out of this. Well, a few stories. I'm, 18 books later. And it's still fun and exciting to write. And the fans just are eating it up. And so the concept was to retell mostly Bible stories, but also other stories that might be relevant to the Bible, that would depict, the Watchers, the divine council, the spiritual warfare that we talked about, so the Nephilim, the giants, that whole thing. What is that whole thing? The Nephilim and the giants, and what's it all about? And so my goal was, my understanding is that they're very theologically important and connected. And so by writing these novels, I'm sort of doing a narrative theology of this divine council worldview. And so what happened was I did the Chronicles of the Nephilim, and I kind of recognized that, I picked the stories that were most pronounced to me. And they were usually the stories more like with giants in them, because I knew there was enough to write. And then you go, well, what about Jesus? There's no giants in Jesus. Well, as you and I have taught, we believe that the demons are probably the spirits of the dead Nephilim. So actually, the Jesus novel sort of ended that series. But I knew that I didn't tell all the stories. I just hit the ones that seem to encapsulate the most important thing to me. But then after I finished that series, and then I wrote my Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and that's sort of like the first century. But I realized, now there's a few stories left that I jumped over that I need to touch. One of which was, of course, Moses. Because, Moses was, you've got that verse where God says, I'm going to judge the gods of Egypt.
Right.
How could I have not written that novel? I jumped from Abraham to Joshua, and I'm like, why did I do that? I don't know. Don't ask me. I think at the time I was looking for literal giant references, and there weren't giant references in Moses, but there's implicit ones and stuff. So I brought that on Moses, and then I wrote Jezebel because at that time period, we're talking like 800 BC or something like that. What struck me was that forgive me, I hope I'm not going too long here, but it's getting there. It's getting the Maccabees. But Jezebel I learned so much about how deeply into idolatry Israel had become. I'd always had this understanding of sort of like Israel in the Old Testament was like a drunk who falls off the wagon occasionally, like monotheists who occasionally fall into polytheism and have to get pulled back in. But I realized through my research, no, they were actually polytheists who were occasionally pulled back onto the wagon of monotheism. And it was so deeply rooted in everything they did. Even in times of righteous kings, the common folk were worshiping little idols. They had teraphim and all this kind of stuff.
Sure.
And my Christian understanding of spirituality is so absolutist, black and white. I wouldn't say that it was right, obviously, but to understand that, hey, we're all sinners, and even when God was blessing Israel, there was idol worship going on, and that reality struck me that I had to write that story because the idols were, of course, the gods of the nations, Asherah and Baal and all that. And so now I'm to the, there's a couple more that I wanted to touch on. And one of them was the Maccabees, because I thought, okay, the Maccabees is not in the Bible. It's in the Apocrypha. But it was a very interesting time period, a transition, the intertestamental time period between the Old Testaments. Malachi was the last prophet, and then 400 years till Christ came, right? But the Maccabees is this major event of history where, the Jews, probably for one of the first times in a long time, for that whole time period, really, that they were able to fight back against their oppressors and overthrow them for a short time period, and that itself is significant, right? But the other component of it that struck me was how the Maccabee story is this, it's a long story and it goes on beyond Hanukkah, but the Hanukkah part of it in First Maccabees, where it leads up to the cleansing of the temple. While all my stories, a lot of them are focused around the temple and cosmic mountains. And so I like telling stories related to the temple because the temple to me, I understand it as the incarnation of the Old Covenant, and it was the earthly metaphor or symbol of the Garden of Eden, and so that's important to me, interesting as well theologically. But so of course this was the one time when the temple was cleansed, and the other element of it that made me want to write it was discovering that there are in Second Maccabees there are a couple references to some spiritual warfare that is at least consistent with our divine council worldview. Like where they see, when Alexandria, Egypt is surrounded by armies, they see heavenly battle warriors and stuff. So I thought, well, that's interesting. That's connected with what I'm doing. And then lastly, just discovering how Daniel, in a way, the Maccabees fulfills some of the prophecies of Daniel. And of course, Daniel, which will probably be my next series of novels, he was, of course, that's the one story I didn't tell enough Chronicles and Nephilim. And I thought, wow, that's the one that explicitly has watchers and the Prince of Persia battling the Prince of Greece. Why didn't I do that story? I think at the time I thought it's just too big. It's just too big, But now I realize, wow, as I told that story, fulfilling that, and we'll talk about exactly what, the Abomination of Desolation is one of those. And that was sort of like the impetus for, this would be worth telling a story. But also, I like the notion that it's not strictly in the Bible. It's extra biblical, but it is historical, and it's a little bit of controversy because I know a lot of Christians. Look, nowadays, I think Christians are more open-minded and willing to, explore Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, and I think it's a good thing. And you don't have to think this is scripture to appreciate it. But I still think that there's, a lot of Christians that still have a hang-up of the inability to accept anything other than the Bible. It's not in the Bible, so therefore it has no value. It's like, come on, man. So it does have some historical value. And then as I looked into the Apocrypha, it was really an amazing journey of discovery. And I'm still stuck on it. Like I'm gobbling up all kinds of stuff on the Septuagint, because the Septuagint, which is, so where do I begin? So the Septuagint is basically the Greek translation of the Old Testament that we have that began around 280 to 250 BC. All right. And that's an important text because even though it's in Greek, it was translated by ancient Hebrews in Alexandria, Egypt, who were commissioned by Ptolemy, the king there, because he had the great library, right? The Alexandrian library, right. And that was just beginning at the time. And so he wanted to have all these world literature, and it had to be in Greek because everyone was speaking Greek, thanks to Alexander the Great, right? So he has these, and there's legends about it. The letter of Aristeas talks about how he commissioned 12 scribes from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, like 72 scribes to come, and they, there's legends that they translate it within, I don't remember, 72 days or something like that, and all their translations, they had multiple translators and they all translate exactly the same way. So, there's obviously that legend to it, but the basic historicity of it is probably true, that he had these translators and they translated it into Greek. But what's so interesting about that, and here's the other component that inspired me to pursue this further, was the Septuagint, and the word Septuagint basically is Latin for the 70, which
right.
is a reference to the rough approximation of the amount of scribes. 72 is roughly 70, and they don't know exactly, right? So I think Josephus rounds it up down to 70. But the idea there is that it was the first time where this ancient Hebrew, probably Paleo-Hebrew, the most ancient versions of it, closest to the original as possible, this obscure language of this one little people, right, gets translated into the universal language of the whole world at the time, the known world, right? And of course, what's so important about that is, without that, the gospel wouldn't have been able to go to all the nations, because the Septuagint was the Bible that the apostles and Jesus were quoting from in the New Testament. And this is very important because many Christians will say, the Hebrew, the original Hebrew is that's the truest text. And there's some truth to that, but it's actually not the entire truth, and it's not entirely true. Meaning, the Hebrew text that we have, the oldest, is, because before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest was the Masoretic text, which was translations, Hebrew, scribal edition of the Bible, of the Old Testament. But that was around, the oldest manuscript we have is around 600 or 500 AD. And we're talking the Middle Ages here. And there is evidence within the Masoretic text that it was actually, it was translated in response to the Christian success with the Septuagint, convincing people that Jesus was born of a virgin, right? Mm-hmm. Isaiah 7:14, and various other passages. And so they adjusted, they wanted to have their own Bible separate so that more and more Jews would not become Christians. And there actually is evidence that they altered some key passages in their Masoretic inscriptions to go against what the Septuagint had. Now, the Septuagint's in Greek, but remember, it was translated by ancient Hebrews in 250, 280 BC, who were working from older Hebrew manuscripts, right?
Right.
And so, the raw truth about textual criticism, meaning that area of study of the Bible where we have many, many different texts with many, many different variations, and you have to be honest as a Christian and acknowledge that. The variations don't necessarily mean that they're like wild. They're not always wild, but there are a few wild differences, and you have to admit that. But the study of the text and its transmission has been a fascinating journey for me. I did that because of my pursuit of how do I explain to Christians, the value of, reading a book in the Apocrypha that they think Apocrypha means false, And I tumbled down this rabbit hole, which has been really fascinating, and haven't even gotten to talking about the Maccabees yet, right? But that's it. Let's put it this way. I want Christians to be able to get back to appreciating these ancient texts like the Apocrypha that the early church did. If you want to talk about the early church versus the modern church, the early church respected them. And there were some who considered them scripture. The Eastern Orthodox do, Roman Catholics do, and there were many church fathers who did. But there were many who didn't. And there are good arguments. I think the best arguments are the fact that they're not scripture, apocrypha, but that the conclusion of most of the reformers during the Reformation period, which is a period that's important to me, they, including Martin Luther, they concluded okay, these aren't scripture, but they're worthy of instruction and holiness. So they're helpful. They're helpful tools. And so I wanted to encourage Christians that, hey, it's you don't have to think of these as scripture to appreciate, just like we always talk about the book of First Enoch. It's very similar in that sense. Why can't we draw some interesting spiritual information or challenges or thoughts from these texts? And that, of course, is a story that is it's like a Braveheart story for me. And Braveheart's my favorite movie of all time. So it's like, you know what? If I get a chance to write a Braveheart story, I'll do it, And that was sort of the opening salvo of telling a story. And I only tell the first part only up to the cleansing of the temple, which is the basis of the holiday Hanukkah, which is not in the Bible, but Jews celebrate it, right? And then there's still, after the temple was cleansed, though, there were still problems and wars went on for years with the Maccabees and the Seleucids and stuff. But ultimately, Rome would come in and take over and squash everything, But I just tell that one particular story that is the most important in my mind, So that was, and it turned out to be two novels. I always set out to write one novel, but as I developed the story, I realized, wow, it was growing. And I thought, it's going to need two novels. And then what I did was, the second novel is a little bit shorter. So what I did was I put a long appendix at the end of that one. My fans will appreciate that, about the Abomination of Desolation. Because one of the key components of this story is the Abomination of Desolation, spoken of in Daniel. And the book of Maccabees, I had always had Daniel 11 was one of the most weirdest, confusing passages, because it's just king of the north, king of the south, king of the north, king of the south. And it's just like, what is this stuff, And, but looking into it, it made more sense to me in an exciting way. And I wanted to share that with people. And I focused on the Abomination of Desolation because let's see if I can pull that up there, in Daniel 11 specifically. And by the way, most prophetic viewpoints that I'm aware of, I think they acknowledge this, and that is Daniel 11:31 talks about the abomination that makes desolate. But specifically, it talks about the forces of the king will profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. And it talks about he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. and the wise among the people shall make many understand. For though some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. And it goes on, but the time for the appointed end is not yet, right? And it says, the wise shall stumble, but they will be refined, purified, and made white. And then there's one other reference to this same abomination of desolation in 8 that is I think talking about the same thing, and a little horn who grows exceedingly great, and etc. Now, I'm aware that there are different prophecy interpretations of this, but I think even those who think that these particular ones are for our future, most scholars see this as a prophecy that was fulfilled in the days of the Maccabees, you know, and the reasons why. And here's what's interesting about it is, it's so strongly fit. So if you go to, I just read that one passage in Daniel 11, but if you go through all of Daniel 11 verse by verse, it actually matches up with exactly what happened during the 6 Syrian wars of the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom during that time period of the Maccabees. And, you know, obviously a little bit before, a little bit after, right? And it lines up so perfectly that liberal scholars have said Daniel must have been written in the days of the Maccabees, because there's no way prophecy can be that explicitly correct, right?
Except the Septuagint.
You're referring to something I'm not familiar with.
Well, the Septuagint was translated before those events.
Oh, right. Good point. No, good point. Excellent point. Now here's the interesting thing. I don't know how complex we want to get, but it's kind of fun. The details do get fun to me. I discovered that the Septuagint, what we refer to the Septuagint now, is, you know, the Old Testament with these apocryphal books, but actually the original Septuagint that was translated in 280 BC was actually only the 5 books of Moses. And so technically that's what it was. But then within the next 100 years, they gradually translated the rest of the Old Testament, but it wasn't necessarily all in that one place, if that makes sense. But over time, the word Septuagint becomes a generic term to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? And so the problem that we have with those who claim, so this was interesting, so if Jesus quoted the Apocrypha, if Jesus quoted Septuagint, which is factually known, you know, by scholars, the words that he's quoting are literally from the Septuagint, and we know this because the Septuagint differs at times from the Masoretic Hebrew text, and it's not that Jesus isn't quoting that; he's quoting the Greek. So what's interesting is, so Christians will say, you know, I've even thought about this myself. Well, then, if he's quoting the Septuagint, then that includes the Apocrypha, right? So shouldn't that be considered scripture? Well, here's the problem with that: is that by the time of the 1st century, there were Jews had lists, you know, everyone from Josephus to what have you, they all had lists of what they considered to be canon, right? What was canon. But they never had single books. They were only scrolls. What we know as books are called codexes, and those were actually came into being after the 1st century by Christians who wanted to put things into one book, right? And so the oldest Septuagint that we know of as one book with all the Apocrypha in it, that only goes back to 400 BC, AD. 400
right.
AD or so.
Right.
So the truth is that, and the other, couple that with the fact that Jesus never does quote from any of the Apocrypha, or the New Testament never quotes from any of the Apocrypha as if it's scripture. Now that's evidence, but it's not absolute, because they also don't quote from 5 or 6 other canonized books that we do agree are canon. So while it's not an absolute, it's a strong indication, right? Coupled with the fact that even if you do respect the apocryphal book, in the days of Jesus, there was not a single Septuagint that had those apocrypha in it. They were only separate scrolls anyway. So I don't think that Jesus was quoting from I don't. It's not that I don't think. There's no factual evidence that he would have been quoting from a single codex that had all those books in it. He's quoting from individual scrolls. So that's one of the reasons why I don't, necessarily think it's scripture, but I can also understand and appreciate Christians who do think that it has that value, especially since the history of the church, the Septuagint and including those apocryphal books were accepted by many in the church. So I'll leave it at that. But getting back to Daniel. So this whole abomination thing. So the Abomination of Desolation, people have different interpretations of it, and that's fine. But what I don't think is under dispute is that the abomination spoken of in chapter 11 and chapter 8 is referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the Greek Seleucid king of that time period. And what he did, it describes exactly what he did in coming in, profaning the temple, etc. Now, many people will say, yes, but it also refers to the future. That's a different issue. But I'm just saying that passage directly is fulfilled by Antiochus. Now, there's two more references to the Abomination of Desolation in Daniel. One is in Daniel 9, and that's the classic, 70 weeks prophecy, and then Daniel 12. Now, the research that I did, and I write about this in my appendix, I try to explain to people there's two different abominations of desolation in Daniel. Like I said, some people believe there's just one and then multiple fulfillments, but I'm convinced that it's literally two specific different ones. And the reason why is because in Daniel 9 and in Daniel 12, it talks about the bringer of the abomination not only desolates the temple, but destroys the temple. And the desolation is like 1290 days or something like that, right? But the abomination spoken of in Daniel 11 and 8, that only desolates the temple. He does not destroy it. So there's two very different abominations. So my understanding is that there are two different to be fulfilled in history. One was fulfilled in the Maccabees, and then there was one future that would happen. And that's when Jesus says the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, he's referring to that second abomination that was yet to be fulfilled in his future. And so that's kind of how I understand it. But I wanted to, rather than focusing on the future one, I was focusing on this particular one and what that means, right? So that was sort of the theological universe that drew me in. But the story itself really was an exciting, Judah is this Judah Maccabee, or in the translations, he's called Judas Maccabeus, which is the Greek way of saying Judah Maccabee. Mm-hmm. And the word Maccabee means they're not entirely sure, but they think it means the hammer, as in like the hammer of God. And in other words, he was the hammer against, the Greek forces, right? And so his story was so interesting to me as an action story, but all my stories, I always bring love and romance into it because I love that stuff, So here's what's interesting. If you read the book of Maccabees, there's two different books. There's four, but there's two that are respected historically, First and Second Maccabees. And what's interesting about those is they have overlap and they tell some of the same story, but they have some contradicting information, and some just different perspectives. But the story of Judas Maccabeus, his story doesn't begin until he revolts. So we don't know anything about him beforehand. We just know that he comes from a priestly family and he had like 4 other brothers. And it's logical to assume that if you're raised in a priestly family, you end up becoming a priest. But we know that that's not absolutely true. And there's always, children who wander away from their family. So I actually made Judah Maccabee start out as a Hellenistic mercenary for King Antiochus. So he's up in Antioch. Mm-hmm. And the reason why was because he was just lost the faith of his father, so to speak, right? He just didn't, he believed in Hellenism because at that time, many Jews were Hellenized, which means they believe their Jewish religion, but they also incorporated a lot of Greek culture and even some of the idolatrous religion, but not necessarily. They would have like gymnasiums in city. They built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, which the Hasidim Jews, the very holy Jews at the time, they hated it because of course, the gym was not just a place of physical exercise, but it was teaching, and they taught Greek worldview. And there was also some pederasty going on there. But many Jews did accept it. And Hellenism became a big problem, obviously, by the time of Jesus, right? So I wanted to say, well, what if there was one of the Jews who had gotten sick and tired of his, the oppression of his father's religion, how young people do that.
Yeah.
And he loved Hellenism, and he was drawn into the culture. But then as he's a mercenary and as he becomes drawn into the story of King Antiochus and his oppression, he starts to see the oppression against his own people, and he becomes broken by it, and he realizes he's made a mistake. So he goes back to his family and he rejoins them, and he's a broken man, and his family has problems with him, right? So that's kind of the general story, that the fictional element that I brought to it. So much so that the first book, part 1 of Judah Maccabee, is more about that setup, more about the historical background and setup of Judah and about the time period. And then the second follows more explicitly what's going on, in those novels. But I'm sorry, in First and Second Maccabees. But there's another component about it that was really interesting. Was First Maccabees is a telling that some scholars argue reflects a proto-Sadducean worldview.
Okay.
Which means there weren't Pharisees and Sadducees at that time. But if we look at history, the Pharisee-Sadducee distinction that we now know about in the time of Christ began in the days of the Maccabees. Yes. And so they think that and I think it does reflect a more Sadducean outlook. Why? Because number one, there is no spiritual component in there, like angels in there at all. And secondly, there's no references to resurrection. And that's important because Second Maccabees, they argue, was probably written by a proto-Pharisee, because there are a couple of stories about angelic warfare going on. And when there's this very powerful sequence in the story that I also bring out in my novels, and it's very well known through history, and it's a sequence about the martyrs of the Jews. And what happened was King Antiochus, while he was pursuing his power plays with Egypt, he goes down to Egypt around 168 BC for the second time. And Rome tells him, get out of there or we're going to squash you. So he goes on the way back, and he hears, now understand that at that time, Israel was under his authority. So he hears about a civil war that's going on in Jerusalem, but he thinks it's a rebellion against him. So he goes to Jerusalem to squash this rebellion. And this is a time where he, he's been ruling over them for years, and his family has a history of tolerance with Jews, but he becomes completely intolerant, so much so that he says, look, you guys are going to my father let you have your own religion and your own separate stuff so long as you respected us and followed laws and stuff. But now you're going to have to Hellenize like everybody else. You're going to have to worship Zeus. He set up a statue of Zeus in the holy temple and forced them to make sacrifices of unclean animals, including pigs and stuff. And he told them, look, you're going to have to give up your tradition, all your customs, all your taboos. You're going to have to eat pork. No more of these restricted diets. You can't get circumcised. He basically just told them you have to disobey your entire law. So it was the dietary restrictions, the circumcision, and just, their rules. And they had to also sacrifice to Zeus, right, at the temple. And the Jews would not. It was so excessive. Many of them wouldn't. Some of them did, but many of them wouldn't. And then those who wouldn't, First and Second Maccabees tells this long story or long sequence about this woman and her 7 sons, of many who were persecuted at that time, but they would not eat pork and they would not obey the king in terms of violating their God's law. And so because of that, he tortures them all. And it's very brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another book of Fourth Maccabees that is well known to not, it was written way later after the case, and it was written by a strong Hellenistic Jew who was trying to show that our reason is more important than our feelings, but he told this long, detailed story of all the torture of these 7 sons and their mother, as well as an old scribe named Eleazar. So this is all in those books, and I brought those characters into my story and retold that story and that martyrdom sequence, which is really brutal and powerful. And I try to do it, within reason and not so excessive that it will maybe it's PG-13 or more, but my goal was that incident actually became a reference point for the first century Christians, because they were being martyred for their faith, and they often called upon that story. You know what I'm saying? So, but then that was that, and I tell that in the novels. But then that becomes a inspiration for ultimately this family of Judah Maccabee. His father, his name was Mattathiah, and he had the 5 sons, and he was a priest. And they basically, it drove them to the point where enough is enough. We are not going to keep obeying this king. We're going to fight back. And they rose up in revolt. And they, when the king's men came to their little hometown called Modin, they were forced to sacrifice on an altar in the town square to Zeus. And one Jewish priest did it, but Mattathias came out and he killed him, and he killed the Greek leader, and the town rose up and they killed all the Greek soldiers that were there. And then those men then went off into the wilderness, and they became the guerrilla group that would ultimately grow to become Judah Maccabee's army. And at the time, Judah's father, Mattathiah, was actually the leader. He was the general until he dies. And then when he dies, he appoints Judah to be his, to take over, right? And there's a whole bunch of fascinating things between Judah and his 4 brothers. And I have them all as characters in my story. And there's birth order issues and stuff like that. But Judah was actually the 3rd born. He wasn't the firstborn. Why would a father pick the 3rd born to lead? You know what I mean? That's kind of weird, right?
Yeah, it's a pattern in the Bible, though. I mean, Judah among the tribes of Israel Judah was not the firstborn; it was Reuben. Reuben,
good point.
Yeah, Reuben lost his birthright by sleeping with dad's concubine Bilhah. So,
yeah. So there you go. So, but each of these characters, and even in the book of Maccabees, each of these characters, these brothers. Let me see if I can find their little names. So they're all given these names in Greek that have been translated. And one is John, which was the eldest, was called John the Fortunate. And what would that mean? If John's the eldest, but he wasn't picked to lead, but he was called the Fortunate, well, I decided to make that be John was a fortunate in terms of being a strong, big monster of a man and a great warrior, but he didn't have as much brains as his brothers, right? So, he's a little simpler, not simple-minded, but I'm just saying he wasn't as well thought out. And then Simon is the 2nd born. And of course, Simon was called Simon the Wise. And that's because Mattathias said when he was dying, and he says, okay, you got to take over this revolt. And he tells Judah's going to lead, but Simon will be your counselor. because he is wiser than you, and listen to everything he says. Well, of course, think about that, though. Even though that's the case, you can imagine the jealousy, the sibling rivalry that's going on between Simon and Judah. So I have that in the story as well. And then the younger brothers, Eleazar was the next youngest, and he's called Eleazar the Piercer. And that's because he became known for being good with a javelin, but he actually killed an elephant in one of the later battles. That was what?
That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. So he became known, and he killed one of the elephants. He actually dies in that, but it becomes a rallying point that turns the battle around, and in a very crucial way. And then the youngest was Jonathan, and he was called Jonathan the Dissembler. And I thought, well, maybe he's the youngest, so maybe he has to learn how to use his words, and maybe he's the politician of the brothers. He's the one who can use his words to speak and win his way against all of his older brothers. So I drew from all these factual things that are in the text and tried to build a sort of family dynamic that was going on between those brothers. But the disappointing thing about Maccabees is, like a lot of the ancient literature, it was male centric, so you don't hear much about women in those stories. So I had to, and it never talks about Judah having a wife. There's one point in Second Maccabees where he's told to marry and settle down, but that's probably a legend. But nonetheless, but I created a love interest where he begins the story falling in love with ironically, remember now, I have him as a Hellenist mercenary for the king up in Antioch when the story begins. And Antioch's 300 miles from Jerusalem. It's on it became a key center for a lot of things, but for the kingdom of Seleucia in particular. And he, so he meets a Hellenistic Greek woman whose family is actually converting to Judaism, right when the story begins. And so there's this cross paths where he's kind of lost his faith, and she's gaining it, but he falls in love with her, and that becomes an inspirational love story that leads to a very powerful climax that I will not give away. But, I don't know. I could keep going, Derek, but I think I should stop and at least let you ask something.
You're an easy interview, Brian. And for time's constraints, we don't want to go too much longer, but so let me just make it easy here. For Christians who are reading this, given that this is a predominantly Jewish story, unlike the accounts in the Old Testament that lead to the coming Messiah, this is a story of the Jews overthrowing the Greek oppressors who really got oppressive under Antiochus Epiphanes, who thought he was literally a god walking the earth, or he was just, insane. But he drove the Jews beyond what they could bear in their religion, driving Mattathias and his sons to lead this rebellion. What do you hope Christians will take away from this? Because again, the upshot of all this is it leads to the cleansing of the temple and Hanukkah. But, we as Christians, okay, we're aware of it. Yeah, it's usually around Christmas time every year. And for a lot of us, that's about all we know. What do you hope Christians take away from both the novels, but also the nonfiction companion book, The Spiritual World of Ancient Israel and Greece?
Yeah, no, that is a good question, actually. Well, there's a couple of things. One is it is a story of how to deal with tyranny and how to fight tyranny. But rather than there are godly ways to fight tyranny and ungodly ways. And in my opinion, revolution, which is like the Marxist notion and most of what the left thinks, just if you don't like the law, you just don't obey it, and you just overthrow your government because they're bad. That is unbiblical and ungodly. But the only justified, what shall we say, rebellion against a tyrant is if that tyrant commands you to disobey God. That's my biblical conviction of what I've come to. And so in this case, he clearly forced them to violate, or tried to force them to violate their God and their worship of God and their obedience to God. So they had every moral right to rise up and to fight against him. And that's where it's different from just like, we hate the government, or because, it steals money or this or that. If it actually commands you to disobey God, that's the only justification for rising up in violence, right? So there's that's the political edge of it. But theologically, well, you know what? This story, and I bring this into the novels as well, because I was inspired by the story of Esther. And we all know that, the name of God never appears in Esther, right? And why is that? Why is that? And it's like, well, maybe God's making the point that even when God doesn't seem to be around, he still is behind the scenes orchestrating everything. He's still in control, right? And this is God's sovereignty. And even if it doesn't look like he's around and it doesn't look like he's there doing anything, he is. And so this is that time period in the intertestamental period. Several things were going on. Number one, God was silent to his people, right? He said, I'm not going to talk to you until I send Elijah. And that's 400 years later, right? And so God is silent. There's no prophets. And even the Jews in the books of Maccabees, it says there are no prophets in Israel at the time. So God was not speaking to his prophets, to his people through prophets. Secondly, God, and why? Why? Because of their idolatry. And that's Daniel talks all about that, right? Because of your sin of idolatry and unfaithfulness, Jeremiah gave you 70 years. Now it's going to be 70 times 7. And so what was I getting to?
God operating from behind the scenes,
right?
Or apparently,
right? Yeah. So, but also we know in Ezekiel, when the Jews were brought into exile, Ezekiel talks about seeing God's presence leave the temple, and of course temple was destroyed and then it was rebuilt, later. But there's never he never returns to the temple, because there are the prophets. When the prophets do start before Malachi, they were saying that Yahweh would return. Well, that was connected to the fact that he left the temple and it was never described as returning. And in the New Testament, Jesus is Yahweh returning. N.T. Wright's written a lot about this. Jesus is Yahweh returning to his temple, right? So God is not speaking to them. He's technically not there with them because he's left the temple and it's been taken over by godless people, right? And so it's just this. Oh, and then lastly was the priesthood. So the priesthood had always been through the Aaronic Zadokite line, the high priests, right? And so in the story of the Maccabees, and I have this all in the novels, by the way. This was the first time when the actual high priest was bought off, not bought off. The king was bribed by a non-Zadokite priest to become the high priest. His name was Menelaus, and he's a villain in my story. And from that point on until Jesus, there was never ever another Zadokite priesthood. The Maccabees, here's one of the downsides. So even though the priesthood's dead and all that's dead, but he's still orchestrating because he's fulfilling Daniel's prophecy and he's bringing them toward Messiah. And I bring that out with the fact that there's a lot less. While I do have the gods in this story, gods battling and stuff, I don't have as much of the angels because they're kind of pulling back, right? And so I want to give that understanding of God's sovereignty, in the midst of a world where you might think, where is God? Because I've experienced that in my own life, and so that's been important to me. That's one of the many components.
That's one of the things that Sharon has made a recurring thread in her Red Wing saga, and it's something that I think resonates with a lot of her readers as well. This phrase, "You are never alone." So even when you're walking, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that kind of thing. Or you're spending 40 years wandering through the wilderness, wondering, when are we getting out of here? Just remember, you are never alone. And I think that's a wonderful message for that so-called silent period, the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. The Jews may have thought they were alone, perhaps foolishly thought that because they could rise up through force of arms and throw off the Greeks and have a short-lived independent kingdom.
Yes.
Between 163, was about 163 or 167 AD when they rebelled.
When they rebelled was 168.
168.
And it went till about 161 before they were overthrown.
And
the Maccabees.
That lasted until you get into the 1st century BC, and then you get the Parthians coming in, and then the Romans, and then it's just.
But see that the Maccabees established the Hasmonean priesthood. That's what the Hasmonean is a reference to, the Maccabees. And so what's interesting is that so even though all these things are going on, God is still in control, and he's bringing about his purpose, and he's with his remnant. That's what I wanted to say, was he's always with his remnant. And there's always the few, like Elijah, right? There's always the few who still believe. And if you don't see them, they're still there, and God is working on their behalf. And there are other components too that, or other elements that I wanted to deal with and communicate to people. But we'll leave that for another day.
Yeah. The novels are Judah Maccabee Part 1, Abomination of Desolation, available now. Judah Maccabee Part 2, Against the Gods of Greece. That'll be released on the 15th of January. So by the time you see this, may very well be available already. Paperback, Kindle from Amazon.com. And more information at Brian's website, Godawa.com. And don't forget and leave out the research behind the novels, the spiritual world of ancient Israel and Greece, biblical background to the novels, Judah Maccabee Parts 1 and 2. That's also available from Amazon. Brian, fascinating stuff as always, and love the way that you take these ideas. It's kind of esoteric and, Genesis 6, Deuteronomy 32, okay, I get all that, but actually seeing it set in a compelling story with characters you care about, that really makes it come to life. And that is really a valuable thing in this day and age, helping people to see that there's a reality here.
Yeah, I want to say something. I forgot. It's really funny. Look, we always talk about the gods, but we didn't even talk about that gods, on this show, which is fine because the whole Jewish side of it is really cool and interesting. But I have all the Greek gods because the Seleucid kingdom was Greek, and according to the Daniel paradigm, if the Seleucid kingdom was in control, their gods were pushed out the other gods. So I have the gods of Greece, Zeus and Hera and all those guys. And when they're battling, the king Antiochus Epiphanes is battling with Egypt against Ptolemy, I have the gods of Egypt. And so, that whole picture is still a part of my novels, as they always are. But I'm also encouraged that, we can talk about other things about my novels than the gods. And so I like that Jewish element, which is an important component of this story. So I'm glad we focused on that.
Yeah. Well, if you've gotten to know any Israelis, you know that they are definitely a stubborn bunch. So trying to get them to do what you want, real challenge, as Antiochus found out.
Yes.
Brian Godawa, his website, Godawa.com. And of course, he is a regular panelist in our monthly Iron and Myth sessions. And Brian, look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Derek.
Check the notes below this audio or video, wherever you're consuming this podcast, to find Brian's work. His website, Godawa.com, is the hub for all things Godawa, and he'll be back next month with our regular crew of Iron and Myth roundtable participants, Judd Burton and Doug Van Doren. Coming up, when you are broadcasting live from a nightmarish hellscape, you want to make sure that you look nice and trim, at least if you're the network news anchor for ABC. I will explain straight ahead, bless his pointy little head, as A View from the Bunker continues.
Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history, a war of gods and men. Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, Moses against the gods of Egypt, and other supernatural historical novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Jesus declared that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. But humans have tried to contact fallen angels on the other side of those gates since the Stone Age, and they're still trying today. Arm yourself with information. During January, our special offer features our new books, The Gates of Hell and Destination Earth, co-authored with Donna Howell and Allie Anderson. Find out where Jesus was baptized, why it wasn't where most people think, and why it was a declaration of war against the fallen realm. How the belief in ancient aliens is based on the New Age and occult teachings of Madame Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley, and how Hollywood has effectively spread the ET gospel. Our 2 new books, plus the DVDs What Lies Beneath, about the world's oldest temple, Göbekli Tepe, and a 13-part teaching DVD based on the second coming of Saturn. This is a $99 value, but during January, it's just $45 plus shipping and handling. Only at gilberthouse.org/store. Driving the internet to think every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. Also online at gilberthouse.org. Gilberthouse.org, that's our main web hub. My website, derekpgilbert.com. On social media, X, formerly Twitter, at View from Bunker, at Derek Gilbert, at GilbertHouse_TV. And on Facebook, the View from the Bunker page there. If you would, please give us a thumbs up. Truth Social, Gab at Derek P. Gilbert, and on YouTube. The channel there is at Gilbert House. Please subscribe, share, click the bell for notifications, hit the like button, and then download our free mobile app to guarantee we never get canceled. That's the way to do it. It's free. It's available for your mobile devices, iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire, phones, or tablets. We've got links to the app stores at gilberthouse.org/app. Also at the View from the Bunker page, VFTB or website. Just look for the link in the top menu bar. You can also put us up on the big screen, your home television. We've got versions of the app available for Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire Stick. If you got a smart TV, Roku, Fire TV, you can add the GHTV, Gilbert House TV app to your smart TV as well. And again, just bring it right to your TV, bypassing the gatekeepers of big tech and striking a blow for the little guys. You can see we're operating from our home studio today because of the 7 inches of snow that hit us here in the Ozarks. In fact, took the time to try to rearrange things, make things a little more efficient. Actually, Sharon did all the work as I'm recovering. Have recovered well from the surgery. Really, it's not the surgery now. It's a neurological thing going on in my feet. So this is now my constant companion as I have to lean on this to keep my balance. I feel like I'm walking in scuba flippers all the time. Seriously. So if you can't raise the front of your feet, you can't compensate for little changes in your center of gravity. So it can be a little difficult sometimes. So carrying stuff like, moving the desk, the computer monitor, God bless her, Sharon. My wife is incredible. I mean, she has done this multiple times in the 27 years that we've been married. I would come home and find the house completely rearranged. Couches, entertainment centers, recliners, moved from one room to another with no assistance from me whatsoever. So this will be our new office, and God bless her for taking on the challenge. But this is how we spent our snow day today, and also our 27th wedding anniversary, as I'm recording this on Friday, January 10th. Now, while this is going on, of course, here in the Ozarks, 7 inches of snow, nothing compared to the disaster that's unfolded this week in Los Angeles as weather conditions, extremely dry conditions, as they've been through extreme drought in 2024, the last 9 months of the year, followed by near hurricane force winds over the better part of this past week, beginning Tuesday. So you've got a number of fires there that are burning out of control, and of course, network news anchors are sending teams to cover the disaster live on scene. ABC News, one of those news organizations, their evening newscast anchor David Muir, who you might remember from the presidential debate that ABC hosted earlier this year. Muir is best remembered from that debate for actively debating Donald Trump. He was jumping in as like a tag team partner to Joe Biden during the debate and debating Trump from the moderator's chair instead of, moderating. Anyway, Muir is a fellow who works out. You can tell. He just does. When he goes on location, he wears a short sleeve shirt. It's like, okay, he's clearly putting some work in at the gym. God bless him. But as he was broadcasting this week, using a specially made custom ABC News, what looks like a fireman's jacket. It's one of those yellow jackets with the reflective stripes across the side, but it's got the ABC News logo on the left pocket here. Muir wearing that. Not a bad idea. I mean, you've got smoke all around. You want to be able to be visible to emergency vehicles trying to get to the fires that they're trying to contain. But at one point, sharp-eyed viewers on social media or sharp-eyed viewers watching the newscast noticed that when Muir turned sideways to the camera to gesture to one of the scenes in the background that he was referring to, they noticed that he'd used, or someone had placed on his back, laundry clothespins to take up the slack, because Muir works out, so he's got sort of a V-shaped torso. Now I volunteered. I managed a tuxedo shop early in my life, and I learned early on that guys who work out don't fit into rental clothing very easily because they're cut for guys of average build like me, okay? Our torsos are more parallel, okay? Not like this. So in order to take up the slack so the coat wasn't hanging on him and making him look less trim and fit, they pinned the back of the jacket, which seems like a rather low priority when you're broadcasting from a disaster area where people are still fleeing for their lives from the flames burning out of control. Seems like you would be concerned with other things than making sure that viewers of your broadcast know that you are, yes, fit and trim. David Muir, bless your pointy little head. We've got a couple of things to tell you about events that are coming up, actually one of them in the very near future. This is the Men's 24/7 Discipleship Weekend. My first trip to Canada, actually, ever. I may have gone once before when I was a boy. No, maybe we did. I think it was at the International Peace Gardens in North Dakota, which straddles the border between the United States and Canada. But that's the only time I've been into Canada. Didn't require a visa or anything. Anyway, it was just a quick trip across the border and back. But I will be there for the weekend of February 20th through 23rd for the Men's 24/7 Discipleship Weekend. This is at Valley View Bible Camp in McGregor, Manitoba. And God bless him, I was referred to the group organizing this event by our good friend Carl Tykrib, who has spoken there in the past. So I consider this high praise. And with Carl's recommendation, well, I'm definitely going to take him up on it. And so I will be there for the weekend with 8 sessions around other events. Again, this is a discipleship weekend for men. The theme of the weekend is Giants, Gods, and Dragons, recovering the biblical worldview of the apostles and prophets. So we'll be talking about things like the divine council worldview and why it is based in Scripture and not something we're trying to impose on the Bible to make it seem more interesting than it actually is. Bible's pretty spectacular already. We don't need to try to sensationalize it to make it more interesting. If you want to find out more about the event, you can find information at valleyviewbiblecamp.com. That's valleyviewbiblecamp, all one word, .com. In July, we'll be at the Go Therefore Conference at the Harvest Revival Center in Brookville, Ohio. Still waiting on details, but GoThereforeConference.com is the place to check for the latest information there. Our tour of Israel, we're still planning to go in October 19th through 30th of 2025. You want to join us in the Holy Land and see why we get so excited when we go there and look at ground zero, as our friend Pastor Carl Gallups calls it, in the long supernatural war between us and the fallen, between the fallen and the Creator. Find out more at gilberthouse.org/travel, gilberthouse.org/travel. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen wherever that may be. If you're listening to one of the podcast websites, Apple Podcasts, Google, well, it's YouTube Music now. They've changed that. YouTube Music, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, which is now Pandora. I've got to update my notes here. Or wherever else you find us, which is, of course, wherever fine podcasts are sold. Thank you. And if you get a spare moment, we'd appreciate a good review. Give us a like at our Facebook page. And remember, our announcer, the inimitable DC Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.